Hello, everyone. Good morning. We are ready to get started for our first panel. Welcome to Forum B for the Pharma and Biotech track. My name is Morgan, and I'm going to be your host, MC guide, right here in Forum B for the next 2 days. If you have any questions during the talk, please use the Brella app. And don't hesitate to find me if you have any other questions. Now, without any further ado, I will introduce our first presentation. Today, we're starting with our panel, Adopting AI in Pharma. If you want to come on up to the stage, and I'll introduce them. We have Dhiraj Pathak from PwC, Arturo Loaiza-Bonilla from Cancer Treatment Centers of America, Faisal Khan, AstraZeneca, Adam Jenkins, Biogen, Grace Yu, EMD Serono, and Kathleen McGraw from Microsoft. Please give a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Dhiraj Pathak from PwC. It's a pleasure to be able to moderate this panel. The guests will introduce themselves in just a moment, but just as a quick intro to myself, I'm based out of our New York offices. I lead a practice around big data platforms and large-scale data infrastructure, basically to bring data into a form that we can start doing AI and machine learning and automation around the data. In addition to working a lot on technology with pharma clients and with provider clients, we also focus on some of the softer sides of using AI in this field. So things like data governance, change management, and increasingly sort of a focus that's very critical for a lot of our clients is around upskilling of people. Not everybody might be tracking in the same way with all the advances that are happening, and I'm sure we'll hear about a lot of that today. But how do you get large sort of teams organized around some of these emerging capabilities? So with that, would like to invite each one of our panel members to introduce themselves, and then we can get into the action.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm Adam Jenkins. I'm the global head of data science for Biogen on the commercial and medical side, so anything outside of R&D. We work, of course, we are a large neurological-based pharma company in Biogen. So thanks for having me.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Faisal Khan. I lead AI and analytics for part of our R&D division within AstraZeneca, focused on two of our key therapy areas. AstraZeneca concentrates within cardiovascular metabolic diseases, oncology, and respiratory and inflammatory diseases. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Arturo Loaiza-Bonilla. I'm a medical oncologist. I'm also the vice chairman of the Department of Medical Oncology at Cancer Treatment Centers of America. As you may know, we're a network of 5 hospitals across the United States, only focused on cancer. As director of research, I'm always very interested in how to integrate those technologies into patient daily care. I'm also the co-founder and chief medical officer of Izybelle, which is a biotech company that does clinical trial matching using AI and machine learning.
Hi, everyone. This is Grace Yu. I currently work in EMD Serono from the portfolio management team. I cover our inline and pipeline products valuation as well. So in the daily life, I think about how to maximize value and mitigate the risks and uncertainty in our portfolio. Neurobiologist by training, consultant for a few years, working alongside many big pharmas, and have been working strategy setting as well as in portfolio management these days. Very good to meet everybody and hope to exchange further thoughts on this topic.
Hi, I'm Kathleen McGraw. I'm the Chief Nursing Information Officer at Microsoft. And I was told we needed to give a fun fact about ourselves. So my fun fact is I just arrived back into the country yesterday at 10 o'clock in the morning from South Africa, where I was there working for 2 weeks in one of the public hospitals. And I actually gave a talk on AI for healthcare and the concerns around biases and ethics within South Africa, right? Because as a developing world, what we're doing in the developed world is going to impact the developing world. And we need to think about that, and they need to be aware of that. So I was working at a hospital that used files, paper medical records. So you can imagine Their opportunity for artificial intelligence is far into the future, but they're very worried about what we're doing and how it will impact them.
All right, perfect. So we'll try to keep it sort of fairly relaxed. And so we'll have a dialogue style going on the forum. In the meanwhile, if any of you in the audience wish to chime in or ask or pose a question to any of us here, feel free. So just let's keep it interactive. But just to kick things off, let's start with sort of a quick round around what we mean by AI and just set the stage a little bit of what's AI, and particularly what is AI when it comes to the work that we do in pharma life sciences. So Adam, why don't you start?
Yeah, so AI to me is really it's the usage of information that is outside of kind of your general knowledge. You know, anything it can be model based, it can even be business rules, anything that is a useful, and this is kind of where I think data science used to get kind of caught up. What is it? It's really the use of algorithms, whether they be complex or even simple, to really help out what you're doing. So in pharma, it could be clinical trial matching, molecule development, patient finding type of aspects. So it doesn't have to be some complex, deep layer neural network that people think it is. To me, it's anything where you're using math more or less and programming to really just augment and make yourself smarter on the business or on the patient side.
I think there was a great point raised in this morning's session about the need for good definitions. AI, machine learning, data science, these terms tend to get thrown around a lot. The way I think about it is pure AI is what we think about as a self-aware computer, et cetera. Oftentimes in computer science, that's called hard AI. We've always been 50 years away from that, and I think we'll continue to be 50 years away from that. But then once you get into what's known as soft AI, and you start thinking about pattern recognition and ways for computers and machinery to approximate portions of human intelligence and then accelerate it beyond, in some cases, human capacity. And that's where you start to get into areas like machine learning and helping machines learn patterns and make decisions, whether it's something like figuring out the shortest route somewhere, which Google Maps can approximate, or now looking at hundreds of thousands of images, which is something that is perhaps beyond human capacity to make some decisions. So it's important to dig into some of those differences, and the term data science is, I think, a broad overall encompassing term that even goes beyond that. It's about using data for insights and more beyond that. How do we govern and organize data to prepare it for those insights?
Right, and I think I agree with the same comments. One thing I'm always thinking about 50 years ahead. For example, that would be great if we have a computer that can replace me as an oncologist. That would be amazing. But I know that's never going to happen because there's going to be the nuances between how you deal with a patient, how you look at all the emerging data. But we can use technology to help us to really deliver the best care and optimizing time. So instead of me just going through a gazillion records and trying to structure data so we can prove that the survival is better for patients, we can use AI tools and machine learning and whatnot to do, for example, synthetic control arms. So we can, instead of putting patients on placebo, we put patients on basically a simulated role of how they did across multiple clinical trials that have been done before, and then compare it to the active arm that the patient is in front of me. So just getting those use cases and could be very straightforward, and we can use those technologies now. And anything that can make our lives easier and saves time and effort, and we can actually spend more time with patients is really, really what it makes really close to my heart in that sense. So computer vision, making sure the pathology is well read, that we have good outcomes for our pharma partners and whatnot. That's, for me, is essential. And that's why I also think that clinical trial matching was really a very close thing to me, because you can do that. It's just data. You have to match it in front of the patient. So that's just part of the use cases I'm thinking of now.
Yeah, I think the panelists said it very well so far. I think if you think about AI, there are so many hot buzzwords out there. AI, machine learning, what's the definition, what's the difference, right? So to me, I think Adam mentioned the hard AI and soft AI. There were also the strong AI, which is essentially the recreation of human cognition, right, using machines. And the weak AI, which is achieving the same goal, but not necessarily tapping into human reasoning. And there's the third category, which is actually where we see the most application so far, which is using AI to augment, but not to replace human creativity, human invention. I think you will see a lot of use cases in this area, like self-driving cars, the search engine using by Google, the image recognition, natural processing, natural language processing, which is a really hot topic these days. And what's particularly relevant for pharma, of course, is machine learning, right? I think it's been in existence for about 50 years. Of course, the recent data explosion as well as the computer power, processing power increase has tremendously fueled this area. So there's a lot of movement in this area. So this is just a teaser. I'm sure there are more discussions to happen later.
I agree with everything everyone has said. I would just, and I was going to mention the augmented intelligence, but I think I would just stretch the insight into foresight. So I think within pharma and healthcare, where can we use AI/machine learning to kind of make better predictions or be more prescriptive?
I also just wanted to comment on something you said, Arturo, which is you might get replaced. I think that's something that's, if it will happen, is a long way in the future. There's a great quote I've heard, which is, artificial intelligence is not going to replace your traditional experts in drug discovery, but those who use AI will replace those who don't. And I think that's the right context for us to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit and now sort of systematically digging into what's required to succeed with AI, I'd like to sort of have the panel weigh in on, from an organizational people perspective, how do you sort of see yourselves and what you sort of feel are the right ways of organizing ourselves to kind of be effective with this discipline? So maybe we can sort of, rather than just going linear, let's see who wants to go first. Let's try and mix it up a little bit. Maybe Grace.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to take the challenge. It's a big topic. I think there are several ideas come to mind as you raise this very important question. Number one, you do have to have the talent, right? And you need to have a center of excellence somewhere. We see a lot of like chief digital officer being established these days. We do have one at Merck KGaA at the corporate level, Novartis, for example. So you do need to have that centralized knowledge sharing, best practices division that could facilitate the AI initiatives across. And then you also see the individual grassroots initiatives popping up everywhere in the organization, and having a forum for best practice exchange is critical. The other thought, I think, in facilitating that is to foster the next generation of AI-oriented minds, right? Internally bringing new blood and also training the internal talents to go toward that direction. Yeah.
There's an interesting quote that, incidentally, my boss, who's speaking right after this, hint, hint, stick around for his presentation, likes to say, everyone is a data scientist, whether it's capital D or lowercase d. And I think that's speaking to the fact that we're fast moving into a world where everyone is using data to extract information for their jobs. But particularly within our field, it's difficult because data science outside of healthcare is such a hot competitive area. So how do we nurture talent? How do we bring in good talent and focus on giving them the right opportunities to grow in their own career? And there are many different types of data science. There was a great article I read on LinkedIn recently about data science is such a broad term. Now there's folks working on organizing data, figuring out what you can do with data versus also going on into deriving insights from that data. And one framework that we found really helpful is to think about data science in those respects in AI, whether you're controlling data, organizing it, or deriving insights. That's helped us structure the data science community in a very effective manner.
Right, I think I echo what Faisal is saying as well as Grace, is that there has to be a culture of like innovation in every single institution you work with. So either on provider side on my end, at CTCA, we're learning that because, you know, as providers, even we do research and try to be on the cutting edge of whatever we're doing on the biology side, we're not up to speed on the technology side. We're always running paper charts and doing all these things in a very inefficient fashion, and we're not, when we see IT as a barrier and not as a facilitator of our jobs. So we need to change that and make it centralized so everyone understands that, for not only for this generation, for the future. And I think we're talking, when we had the call the other day, how important it is for every single pharmaceutical company or research enterprise to have like a real funnel. Because there's a lot of places that have a million projects about AI and digital health, et cetera, but no one's talking to each other. So there could be a lot of repetition. And I mean, I think Celine Kurnas, who's here as well from MSEd, we always reach out to different companies. And they say, oh, yeah, we had this project, but then the other group has the same project and all over the place. So we need to get this digital officer kind of like be in the center and have a full assessment of all the tools so there's no repetition and we can really advance the field forward. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also what I think that we lose sight of. The technology is happening very, very rapidly. You know, every year there's a different technology, there's a different language. So we often forget that pharma is a little bit slow in terms of, especially for the people up here, you know, for the Microsofts and the Biogens and the large companies, things aren't going to happen as fast as they do in kind of the small startup space. So in order for us to, to implement anything, you know, it's not just a matter of start a new company and, you know, make all the infrastructure. We are playing with the FDA, the providers, the hospitals of the world. So it's not necessarily just a quick, hey, you know, we'll get an ROI within 18 months, you know, of our investments. You're looking at 5-10 years down the line of starting one of those centers of excellence to really see what that impact's going to be on your top or your bottom line. What we hear a lot about is, you know, especially on the R&D side, you know, identifying molecules through AI that could be, you know, useful for treatment. Well, even if you identify the molecule, you still have to go through all the biology and all the states to validate, go through all the clinical trials. So you're still looking at 10 years of, you know, getting that usefulness kind of into the clinic.
I think that touches on how the applications of AI in pharma are very different than other industries. Mm-hmm. I have friends and colleagues who, for example, work in social media or web advertising or other domains where rigor is required, but perhaps that regulatory burden is not as high as in making sure you get everything done right. So not only do we have to self-impose the rigor around making sure that we don't have bias in our training and test sets, we've validated, we've thought through potential use cases, but then there's external agencies who are also double checking and making sure we're doing that right. And that's, I think, a good burden to have, but that's one that hardly exists in other industries outside of perhaps the financial industry as well. So sometimes you talk with data scientists who are perhaps moving much faster than we are. In many cases, it's good inspiration, but they're making mistakes or perhaps not being as careful because those industries can tolerate that. And ours, quite frankly, just can't.
I agree with that, but I also think that all four of you have talked about the IT side, and I'm here to represent the clinical side. Mm-hmm. There is a complexity within our domain where you have to marry the IT and the clinical, right, together, and that can be very complicated. And there needs to be conversations on both sides and how they can kind of bridge the gap, right? Because a lot of clinical folks are not necessarily technical, and we know the technical are not clinical, and they need to have an understanding of it. And I think that's where our regulatory, our data governance, and just pulling together the correct resources with the correct education can really help with that. And other domains don't necessarily have to worry about that as much because, and of course we have lives on the line, so we have to think about it in the patient and the provider context as well.
So just to pick up on that, and I mean, some of you have already touched on this a little bit, but in terms of how do you see the interface developing between the data scientists, the technical people, or like you said, the IT, and the non-technical, the biologists, the chemists, the pharmacologists, and everybody else who comes together to drive the business in pharma? Thoughts and perspectives on how is that a challenge? Is that just beginning to happen naturally? Would be interesting to hear from any of you who might have thoughts on that.
So I'll take a pass since you guys, nobody jumped in there. So I think that it's a tremendous challenge, and I think that there's like a dichotomy depending on the potential age of the person, and they're quick to uptake technology, so they are looking into AI and understanding the business process of it as well as the technical. But then I think there are other folks where it's farther apart, right? They haven't necessarily, maybe within their job category, they've had to learn a little bit more, but maybe they don't really totally understand. I'll give you a good example. I work with nurses and chief nursing officers all the time, so this is not specific to pharma, but this is, clinical provider. and they deal with clinical decision support every day, and they ask me what's the difference between clinical decision support and artificial intelligence, because they really don't know. So essentially they're using a rules-based engine that maybe flags for a laboratory result or says this is the best candidate for a clinical trial, but they don't really understand the underpinnings behind it. And I think it's our responsibility. I think definitely Microsoft takes it as a very strong responsibility that we need to educate folks to understand what is artificial intelligence, what are the ethics behind it, how can we use it empathetically, and how can we ensure that we don't have these biases. I think that the data scientists really have very good intentions. I don't think there's a nefarious thought. I think they have very good intentions, but sometimes you create your own bias when you're building your models, and as a clinician, we need to ensure that that doesn't happen. So essentially, we need to keep everyone honest there. And then as you run through and you do more learning with the models, the more you learn, the more that you can take it back and make those changes to ensure those corrections are done. But I think it's education is a big part of it. Some folks will voluntarily get the education like they ask me. Others, we may have to kind of push it a little bit that you do need to get educated. And I don't think that our jobs I don't think the clinicians at the bedside, I don't think they're going to lose their jobs, but I do think there are processes that will be essentially reverted to other jobs. So the gentleman from the AMA talked about 30% of our processes within healthcare are essentially back office processes. Maybe they can be automated. And what can we do better with those people, right? They could do something else within healthcare. Maybe just not do that, the claims data that he showed, right? So, yeah.
To piggyback on Kathleen's point, I think it's important at the interface for anybody from pharma who wanted to take on AI project to know a little bit about the AI, right? What it means, how to build a model, what are the evaluation criteria that you need to look for, how to assess the performance. It's probably much easier for the decision or data scientist to grasp the various concepts in pharma. I think this way around is probably easier. And I can take myself as a guinea pig just to dissect it for everybody. So I took a project with a couple data scientists to predict POS, which is the perfect use case application. And then in the process, if you don't know how a data model would work, how machine learning would work, it's very hard for the data scientist to devise the appropriate model that would perform. Because so far we're using mostly supervised learning where you need to label your inputs. So it's very critical to leverage internal pharma's expertise in terms of how you assess a POS, what are the potential key drivers, and then to inform that model construct. And then you can take iterations and do fast pilots and make a model successful. I think it's probably easier that way.
To build on that, I think we have to, I don't want to sound like, hey, we're protecting our turf, but pharma can be very complex. Like you said, there's so many different disciplines that come together in healthcare that if you don't keep that context in mind and people don't work in a partnership together, just throwing a lot of technology is not going to solve a problem. We've recently, I think in the last 4 or 5 years, seen this hype curve where there was a lot of buzz around Watson, for instance. And over the last 6 to 8 months, we've now started to recognize that awesome, fantastic technology has struggled within the healthcare domain for a variety of reasons. And where you've seen successful efforts is where you're not just throwing technology at a problem and saying this will solve it, where you're working with the experts in that domain and that discipline to understand the really nuanced intricacies of biology. And where you've seen those successes come from, it's been phenomenal. And it's not difficult to do. Sometimes people say, well, this is AI stuff and the bench scientists can't understand it. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think if we understand how to interface and represent our expertise in a way that other disciplines can understand it, they're doing the same for us. And they're not new to this. Folks in pharma have worked with biostatisticians, with computer scientists for decades. So I think if we can find that right mix together, that's where you get some really good success.
Right. Yep. No, and I think it's important that everyone's trying to do similar efforts. So instead of just once again avoid replication, you've seen someone who has done it really well, just reach out to them, right? So in your same company, you can find those very good people who actually know what they're talking about, so you don't have to do the research on your own. we've seen it ourselves in CTCA trying to do different projects, and instead of just me reinventing the wheel, I mean, it's been already done. It's in front of me, but I never talked to them. So that's just one key example. And I think also when we're working with pharma, sometimes they have very special divisions like you do have that is dedicated to do that. So we just have to basically borrow our clinical expertise to really make it work. So don't be concerned about outsourcing. I think that's always a key thing. Like just reach out, and who does it the best, just use it for everyone, because everyone has a different interest, and you can use the same resource for multiple projects. So.
Yeah, and to bring it back to what Kathleen said at the start, that the interplay between the technologist and the clinician and those people who are actually treating the patients and kind of out in the field, if you want to think about it like that, we kind of have to change our thinking in terms of don't make a technology and then see where it can fit within the actual marketplace, but rather see what problems are in the marketplace and work with whether it be the clinicians or the nurses, and take a step back and say, okay, here's a problem. What technologies could we try and make to address that issue? So you're actually working with those people from the start, rather than trying to kind of push a technology upon them that they weren't involved with, or they don't really see a need for just quite yet. That's usually the most difficult part.
Yeah, the other point that I wanted to bring up is we don't have unlimited resources in pharma, which in the ideal world, if you have unlimited resources, you can boil the data ocean, right? Because we have gazillions of data these days. But with constrained resource, you definitely need to clean up your data, which is oftentimes unstructured, very messy, and then that's where your expertise comes into play to kind of do a hypothesis right at the beginning and to refine your model over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a good segue into the next topic that we wanted to delve into. So some of you who were at the keynote, I picked up a new word. I'm sure you might have noticed the word itself, or maybe it was an already known word. But the speaker was saying AIzable to refer to data that something needs to be done in order for AI to really happen on the data. And I think, Grace, you already started to get into that topic, but how the next area that we want to explore a little bit with the panel is how do you sort of get a hold of the data? How do you manage the data? What are some of the challenges just around the data to get the enterprise of AI up and running? So maybe
I'll say carefully is the first one that I'll say. There are, especially within the healthcare, the pharma companies themselves are rarely collecting the data themselves. Yes, from an R&D side you are, but from a commercial and a medical, you're working with payers, providers, pharmacies. You're purchasing this data from other people. So in getting that, working with legal, working with everyone who needs to be involved to make sure that everything is compliant, and to get that data, really understanding why you're getting it. We see a lot of companies buying data that they don't actually need. There's claims, there's EHR, there's a million different providers to do the same thing, and you think that getting more data is better, when in actuality having a good question to answer with the data is really what you're trying to succeed at. So in order to get the data, that's the easy part. It's the actual utilization of the data that's usually the much more difficult one.
I think given the fact that AI is relatively new, we've got lots of legacy systems, old databases, et cetera, that exist. I once worked on a project where they said it'll take 30 days to get one study off of tape archive because it was archived in the early 90s. But data is out there. It's just all in different silos. And we have a lot of different efforts that for a particular project, we'll go and try to get this data, and someone will spend months pulling it together, and then not much happens with it. That project reads out or is finished, and then you're done. I think to get beyond that stage, to really be able to do it at scale, you have to develop formal processes around getting your data to be AIzable or analytics ready. That means bringing it together, forming those connections, thinking through the privacy, legal and ethical issues. Particularly in pharma, you've got to worry about things like HIPAA and personally identifiable information, and the regulations within Europe, et cetera, where some countries say you can't use our data outside of our country. So getting ahead of the game, thinking through all those processes from a governance perspective, and going hand in hand then with the technical solutions that say, okay, here's how we'll ingest data. If they're in old databases, et cetera, we'll bring them into a data lake, data ocean, whatever your favorite term is, and get it ready for analysis. That's how you can then accelerate. That's how you can then do fast analyses and scale them out for the results that seem interesting and exciting. But if you have to invest in doing that correctly. If you're just doing a lot of one-off pilots or a lot of one-off analyses, you don't get those economies of scale which can serve that acceleration.
Right, and I think, yeah, just reflecting on those things, is how many more HEOR divisions we need in every single pharma company. Sometimes you see like there's 20 people working on 20 different projects once again. And I think we just need to put a basic framework of what are the key questions we want to solve with data. So we want to know about quality, we want to know about outcomes for patients, we're looking for commercial, like consuming anything that's going on with different pharmaceutical agents or genomics. But we need to really have a good framework and not just looking data for the sake of it. Because as you said, there's so many data points that we can look for. But at the end of the day, we want to first advance science, advance the companies themselves, and help patients. So we need to have those specific frameworks put together, and that hasn't been really put in place as far as I know. So all those different silos that where the data is located, we need to really bring them together and find a single solution, and not just buying claims-based data, which could be outdated, and all there is Medicare, so not really applies. So.
Yeah, I think the panelists said it very well so far. Just a couple watch-outs, right? I think from the beginning, just be mindful that data cleanup or data treatment could take maybe 80+ % of your energy, right, running any AI initiatives. And then be mindful of the resources there. And also think about the value chain, right? How you acquire the data, what are the vendors, what are the sources, how you clean up the data, how you index the data, how you even impute the data if there's missing data, right, data gaps. And how you think about the different granularities of data to serve your purpose, to address the hypothesis that you're trying to address. And then at the end of the day, how you validate, or I think how you validate the data and try to increase the signal-noise ratio in your model. So there are all sorts of considerations, which could be a topic of its own. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. They say data is the new oil, and I think we all agree on this panel the value of data. And we have to really make sure that we utilize it like the precious resource that it is and understand it.
Yeah, I also think there's an imperative for the pharmaceutical industry to come together and maybe think of something like the Genome Project in the early 90s, right? Because the data is out there, but it's just not like collated in such a way that everybody in the industry can tap into it. Everybody's probably doing their own thing, like in the little circle. And if the industry can come together, then there's tremendous value that can be unlocked from the data.
Right, and we have all these capabilities of like maybe doing blockchain technology and whatnot, so people actually, everyone gets a little piece of that, all that vast money, right? So many times it's just, I own the data, so I'm the major shareholder of this, and I'm the only one who's gonna benefit from this, but either the patient doesn't have any access to that benefit, or the pharma company, or anyone else. So we need to find a way that we can, share the wealth with everyone involved, including for the people who did the analytics, the patient who actually provided the data, and the end user of that data. So I think there's an opportunity with an AI, blockchain, and whatnot to really kind of help everyone so people can be more open to, share the information. If I have my own institution and I think I'm going to be the one, I have this gold mine, but no one's going to touch it because I'm just the greedy guy who doesn't want to give it away because they're going to take it from me. If we want to monetize it, everyone should get a piece of it, so everyone's willing to collaborate. So I think that's one thing that we need to learn in the future.
There are consortiums and initiatives trying to do that. So within pharma, for example, you have Transcelerate, which is a consortium of some of the big and small pharma companies that have come together. In the oncology space specifically, you have programs like Project Datasphere, which are trying to work on similar projects. The problem, I think, comes into the fact that not everybody fully buys in. And even when they do, they're a little afraid and a little protective of, well, I don't want to give away too much of my secret. And then even once you overcome that hurdle, the fact that within each of these companies, data is in silos and in so many different standards, how do you connect it together? There's 10 different data standards. People come together to spend a year in a committee that come out with what they think is the universal data standard, and now you have 11 data standards, and the cycle repeats itself. So figuring out how to overcome some of these challenges is key. I personally think, and this is you have to be careful with statements like this, but I personally think that unless there is a top-down mandate, it might be difficult to do that. If you think about the regulatory space, folks are pretty consistent in how they submit documents to the FDA, for instance, because there's a top-down mandate to do that. There might need to be some sort of central authority that says, here's at least the formats and standards, and then people have to buy into that consortium or data sharing enterprise given the right incentives and pros and cons.
Yeah, and I think it's also, usually the frustrating thing is, especially when we're working within the U.S., is because all the data systems are different. Again, whether you're coming from a pharmacy or claims or something like that, and then you look internationally, for instance, the UK is the UK Biobank. The Finnish government has their own, where they have these great data sets that we know that are government mandated, that are covering 50% of the population, but we can't utilize them because of data privacy issues. So it's often a time of give and take, whether you want privacy versus kind of innovation and acceleration, where the data has to be kind of usable and accessible to everyone. So I think that we're at kind of an interesting time where we have the conversations of universal healthcare and what that would allow for us from a data standpoint to be able to do if everything is coming kind of through the same system. So if you look at Medicare and Medicaid, you can get all that data kind of, I don't say easily, but you can get that data because it is paid for by the people and the tax dollars, so it's accessible. So something like that is always something interesting to think about.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the new rulings coming down from the ONC around interoperability will impact pharma as well, because the whole purpose of that interoperability is really transparency for the patients, because they don't have accessibility to all of their total health record now, and they will need to have that. So once we see that within, I think, the healthcare space itself, it'll be interesting to see the impact of pharma, because then that data will then become more liquid, right? Because it needs to be interoperable, it needs to be bidirectional. So that, I think, has potential to have impact. And if the FDA is looking at that, especially with CMS moving forward with that, and they're going to change the standard to the US CDI standard, which is interesting because we're actually they're changing from CCDI, which is international standard, to US CDI. So it'll be interesting to see if that'll impact that. As you were talking about, Adam, related to the other countries that deal within pharma space.
The other challenge is data gets old, it gets stale. And what I mean by that is, for instance, if you look at assays, there's newer versions of assays, new equipment that comes out. Calibration settings on imaging software change. You talked about the UK Biobank. Wearable streaming data, for instance, that's there is from older devices that might not be in the market anymore, and newer devices have different standards. So even if you can overcome all of these challenges, it's just bringing together data before it gets too old.
And if you don't purge, your AI trajectory might sort of get affected. I mean, in a sense, if you're reliant on aging data, which is turning into a big issue now.
That's actually a great point. I wanted to build on Adam's point and us, Dhiraj's. I think if you look at the model, right, you have a training data set, you have a development data set, and you have a test data set. And you have to be really mindful your data set's underlying distributions remain consistent or similar across. So take the field of ION, for example, right? It's evolving so quickly with the standard of care, like just being refreshed, like by Keytruda, for example. Would the underlying data distribution from 10 years ago be still applicable for your future treatment paradigm, right? You're trying to predict the future. So that's a huge question. And for anything that's based on a bunch of data, but the underlying distribution is variable, say rare disease, it's an inherent limitation of AI, right? Trying to make any prediction.
Right, so that's then, well, that machine learning and deep learning comes to play, and using like Azure and all these technologies to help us to sort through all this. And I think for oncology, it really holds true, because every day there's a new biomarker, there's a new gene that gets either just in phase 1 clinical trials showing promise, or it gets approved with a new specific biomarker to use, or there's like 5 different IO-based treatments that now are approved in the same line setting that were not able like 5 years ago. So all that data really changes over time, and the same happens with clinical trials. So right now there can be 5 clinical trials on that specific thing, and then you check, a month later, then it's no longer there, all then closed to accrual, or a new standard of care came up, and then now that trial is going to get stuck forever because no one's going to actually enroll to that study because something replaced it, right? So just using that data to make it real smart for knowing also, for example, which studies to close because it's futile anymore doing that effort, or using data to plan ahead of the future and make projections on how to make it really efficient. So you put the money where the right projects are ahead of you.
So moving on, I think we're sort of 2/3 into the panel. I think I'd like to now talk a little bit more concretely about what are some of the case studies that you are seeing either in your own groups or what you think are illustrative of where the field is. So I'll give the panel a moment to sort of see what comes to mind, but whoever has a case study at the tip of their tongue, feel free to jump in. And let's talk a little bit, bring it down to the ground reality of what's actually going on and where are we seeing value from AI in biopharma.
I can open up a little bit, maybe just from the hot spots of pharma, right? Where AI could be particularly good applications. Clinical trial operations are a really good one. There's a tremendous money invested in their area, and it could leverage AI because there's so much data. Pharmacovigilance, real-world evidence these days are good applications potentially, as well as what's safety, right? So for our portfolio decision-making, a particular use case is to predict the probability of success of clinical trials. It's actually a perfect use case for AI, actually machine learning that we're using, because it's based on the binary logic, and you have a really good data set to test the model. So I'm happy to speak more this afternoon, like 1:25.
Way to go,
Stay
Grace.
tuned.
I was just going to say, I think sourcing patients for clinical trials is actually also a good use of AI, and also the education of the patients for what the trials are that are available. So there's so many clinical trials. If there's the ability to know a clinical trial, if you have a certain disease process, if you live within a certain area, and you can kind of whittle it down yourself, or the provider could actually present to the patient the opportunity for clinical trials that are available. Because I think there's just so many opportunities that are lost for pharma to gain subjects into their studies that they just don't have the ability to know who those patients are at the time.
Yeah, and I think that to go along with those, what both Grace and Kathleen have said is, patient finding in general for pharma, utilizing AI is a great use case, and I think the one that most companies are utilizing right now, for either clinical trial, utilizing EHR claims that are linked back to HCPs, where you can say, I think, we can reach out to the physicians and say, we think you have a patient that might be able to, be part of this clinical trial. Whereas, in the past, if those patients or those physicians weren't either part of a research institution or part of a clinical trial institution, we can go and say, we think that you have a patient. We're offering up kind of avenues for patients that haven't had them in the past. And even the next step, for launch of a rare disease product, a lot of patients get lost in the jumble of how many physicians you're seeing and who and when. That if we're able to identify patients who are either misdiagnosed or could potentially benefit from a new therapy, the ability for us to identify them and reach out to their physicians really makes a difference in the marketplace.
I think something that people perhaps outside of pharma don't realize, they think AI is new to pharma. There is no aspect of drug development which is not using advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, data science. Whether it's everything from early molecular discovery, compound structure prediction, crystalline structure, through imaging analytics, radiomics, solid tumor morphology, through operational characteristics like finding patients for trials or developing synthetic control arms, looking at wearable data, and then once you get a drug out into the market, looking at activities like commercialization strategies, et cetera. There's no aspect of the whole value chain currently which is not touched by AI in some way. So in some respects, I think the pharma industry is very mature. Where perhaps we haven't gotten to yet is this whole-scale integration and connection of all of these initiatives. One of our senior leaders, who's actually European-based, likes to say we have more pilots than Lufthansa because we have a lot of different things that we're doing, but how do we scale up beyond that into more integrated, holistic approaches? And I don't think we're unique in that. That's the next step. We're kind of beyond that first introductory phase already, and perhaps people outside of pharma don't realize that.
I do wanted to ask a question though, like when you say we are like all over in AI, are you referring to the old versions of models such as regression or Bayesian, or we are still like slowly following on the advances in the AI industry, right? Because there were so many advancements in the model, on the model side.
So I think the answer is they're using everything, but
Yeah.
I have a personal bias where I would say you have to use what's appropriate. So for instance, I think if you have a deep learning hammer, everything looks like a nail. And you have to find the right tool for the right job. So just because the right tool might be a simple logistic regression model, That doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do, that you have to bring in something really super uber complicated like a GBM model or whatever. So what I would say is, from what I've seen, every area is using an appropriate tool. And everyone's aware of the latest cutting edge technologies and what they can do.
So where do you see the cusp of breakthrough happening in pharma next up?
So for me personally, I think it's a purely AI-developed molecule that goes out into human trials. That hasn't happened yet. I think that would be.
So that's like replacing human intelligence, right? Yeah.
But that's just my personal.
Yeah, that would be an end-to-end, right? So like immediately you file the IND automatically too. Yeah, so it goes to the FDA. So yeah, I think all those points are exactly what I will echo. One thing I think is important is to know the regulatory aspects, as we were mentioning earlier, because we all have all these nice initiatives in front of us, but we don't have really like a regulatory framework to do it. So I would love to see like synthetic control arms seen consistently, even if it's just at the back end for the data, just to validate it for the future. But we don't have that right now. Like, so all the clinical trials still the same model, and not even in the main publications that you see in New England or Journal of Medicine or JAMA, Oncology, any of those show like, okay, we actually ran the model of synthetic control arms and they did exactly the same as the placebo arm that we have with this study. So we know that the data is there and you probably have it and you already showed that it's real, but we don't see it in front of us, so we don't know if that technology is applicable and people will be afraid of using synthetic control arms. I'm not afraid, but I know mainstream will probably be concerned about it, particularly FDA and whatnot. So I think we need to first put it maybe from the real world data perspective and then start to put it more on the front end of research. Another use case that I'm looking at is, as we're not going not just to the provider side, which is my case, but also to the patient side. So the patients now are going online, Dr. Google, and knows everything. So if we can use that AI to actually engage patients for going to clinical trials, to be their own advocates, and to use their own data to really go to the right place, and maybe have a framework where you can do just-in-time approaches. So the patient just has the right biomarkers in the right location, the insurance runs it through because it's really priorly authorized, and you start the clinical trial just in where the patient's practice is. So we can use a lot of technology to really like get the treatment in front of you right away. So it's like having the, a little drone bringing the pill to you, that would be the best thing. But if we can do it just in the closest practice, that would be ideal. So using the technology from that end, and for research operations, so for physicians who are not used to doing research, but it's not rocket science. It's just following certain rules, and that's it. Other than that, it's just patient care. So having that facilitation will be great.
So I think Arturo brought up a good point with the patient. There actually are capabilities today with search where you can locate patients, right, for your clinical trials. But I was going to say, I think it also would benefit pharma to use AI to keep the patient in the study, because a big problem is the dropout rate. So how can you utilize AI, whether your patient's using an app to report their symptoms or things like that, and what can you learn about the patient so you can continue to keep them within the study? And how can the primary investigator know what are the challenges and why are there these dropout rates? Because if we can keep them in this, the longer you can keep the patient in the study, the better it is for the study overall. And actually it would help to expedite these long, lengthy timelines that we know happen with these drug studies.
Yeah, I mean, to take that a step further, it's not even to keep people on clinical trials, but just to kind of identify, pharmacovigilance events in the real world. Patients often don't go to their doctors unless things start to get, above a certain, threshold of what they can handle. When if you can identify those, those adverse events, 3-4 months, beforehand and address them, that's a whole different, kind of use case for the patients. Because again, it's not just that the pharma's, helping you make the drugs, but it's also, they are looking out for your well-being and making sure that they're being effective for the long term.
Yeah, so I guess coming back to the suitable application of AI, like what could be it, right? I think if you have a ton of data, if the underlying distribution remains consistent, right, of your historic versus what you're trying to predict or achieve, and if I think also like data cleanup wise, it's manageable, right? And then I think it's the perfect application. Like there couldn't be any use cases that I think wouldn't leverage AI. But the challenge is how to demonstrate the value creation of AI versus human expertise, right? How do you bring up to your leadership team?
I think one thing people have to be careful about as we see all these opportunities, we mentioned pharmacovigilance, identifying adverse events, keeping patients enrolled. We see a lot of ideas, and sometimes we're really quick to jump on them, but we should also keep in mind, at least within drug development, we're engaged in a randomized controlled trial. And some of these activities may inadvertently have secondary effects where they might bias the outcome of the trial. They might affect what you might have as a readout of the trial. So that's where I think we have to be very careful. And again, to an earlier point, not work in isolation and just say, here's a cool technology, let's apply it. There's a reason why clinical trials are run by large cross-functional teams. You have to think through those implications, because the last thing any one of us wants is to have an impact on a trial. That's adverse.
Yep.
So just a quick point to follow up on that, Faisal. I mean, how are you seeing the sort of the real world data and real world evidence sort of then begin to, because in a sense, the big promise there is to shift some of the burden of the trials from the RCT paradigm into what's already happening out there with real people, with real treatments. Do you see some sort of a tension there in terms of keeping those two kinds of data sort of separated? And maybe, Adam, same question for you as well. How is that dynamic beginning to unfold? Or is it too early days for that to be very clear as to what the strategy is? That would make sense.
I think it's becoming more and more blurred. I say most corporations used to have a real-world data team, and real-world data is just data nowadays. There's no real difference between where you're getting the data from. Now it's just much more how useful is it and kind of how you can apply it. So I think that before, when it used to just be the safety teams looking at real-world data for adverse events and pharmacovigilance, now it's we could utilize those through AI to look at the health economics, patient predicted outcomes, everything of that sort. So I think that's becoming much more broad use case and much more blurred lines between what's RWD and what's just useful.
I think there's already been a lot of work already done in the use of real-world evidence data, particularly as you plan out different trials in traditional RCTs. You're starting to see more and more work towards synthetic control arms, as you were mentioning. And I think you're also seeing the definition of real-world evidence expanding. It used to be just EHR data. Now it includes adjacent domains like perhaps lab-based data, or other things like social media data is also real-world data. You're starting to see the use and incorporation of that. But there's a certain process to be followed, and I think you're seeing more innovation happening in areas where it's harder to run your standard clinical trial. Maybe it's a rare disease. Maybe it's a disease where, for whatever reason, it's hard to get patients enrolled. Maybe it's a pediatric disease or whatever. And there, I think you'll see faster adoption.
Okay, so we're down to sort of the last 9 or 10 minutes. So there are two topics. One, we'll end with some discussion about the future. So this is advance notice to the panel to start thinking about the future challenges. But before we get there, a bit of a discussion we'd like to trigger around sourcing strategy and vendor management in this space, and sort of the classic build versus buy, and are the AI vendor options mature enough or credible enough to start sort of putting some of this out to bid? So invite the panel to share some thinking around what you all are seeing, and where do you see the evolution happen in terms of internal capabilities and sourced capabilities?
Yeah, I always think it's a combination, right? Internal and external. For us, we have an internal like data science team, AI research team even, in the chief digital office, but we also go external because some of the domain expertise is just not there, right? And I think if you want to be agile from the pharma company, you want to tap into these external resources as well. For us, the emerging players in the field, the vendors, are of uneven quality. Some of the people just have an idea, see the business opportunity, and put together a few data science together and offer your solutions. So you want to be extra careful there. Watch out, ask a few questions to really understand what are their solutions, what can they offer, do they have pharma expertise, or is it just a data scientist team, right? So these, I think I would encourage everyone to be cautious in the approach and maybe study AI, the concept and the basic fundamentals of machine learning a little bit, and ask a few thoughtful questions beyond the immediate, the obvious.
Become an informed buyer.
I agree with Grace, and I think that you also need to be aware of your own intellectual property, right? That's your value as an organization, and we talked about data as the new oil, so that it's very valuable, and you want to make sure that you work with someone that's very trustworthy, so that you don't have to be concerned about your intellectual property or the safety of your patient's data.
Right, and I think it's important as well to see who are those members of the team that actually pitching the solution in front of you, because there's a lot of things that as Grace was saying, or there's a lot of new ideas coming, but the team has to have the expertise on the subject matter that you're talking about, right? So if they're rheumatology, or they're talking about immunology, or biomarker discovery, or oncology in my case, you need to see who is comprised on that team, and they actually understand what's the problem in front of you, and also they understand your pipeline and what are you looking for, so they really accommodate to what you're looking. So just have that flexibility and understanding of who is the key player, I think is essential as you're doing the vetting, because everyone's going to have a question and say, yeah, absolutely, we have it, but they really need to have the expertise behind it, at least some clients, right? So,
I think it's definitely going to be that hybrid model that's successful. There's no large pharma company, and even medium to small pharma companies, which don't have an internal data science capability. Hint, hint, we're hiring. But beyond that, I think where you see external partners be the most value add is where they come in with something, a capability, an expertise that you don't have internally, that maybe it's not worth growing out, or you're just too far behind. I see a lot of partners come, and my first question to them is, what's differentiating you from the other 5 companies that have come to us in the last month, or from our own internal team? Yeah. And the ones that are successful are the ones who can answer that, versus the ones who say, well, yeah, we're experts in data science, and we have this really cool tool, and yeah, so does everybody else. So really, for an external partner to be successful, they have to have that clear story for what's their added value proposition. And those are the ones that have fast adoption.
Yeah, and especially with your capabilities. The people who work on a data science team in a pharma are uniquely different than someone working for a Twitter or Google or something like that. They are usually invested a little bit more in the patient than your traditional data scientist. So just supplementing them with kind of knowledge that they might not have from a vendor. What we always say watch out for is the drop and flop. You have a McKinsey or someone come in, they drop a solution and it flops because they don't have any skin in the game. They're not there for a reason other than what they were brought in for, so it doesn't actually necessarily work. So I always say look at your internal teams first and see how you can augment or support them.
I like that term, drop and flop. I'm going to remember that.
Yeah, we've all been there.
All right, I think we are down to the last 10, 15 seconds. I think if there is one point that each panelist wants to contribute in terms of future, let's hear what you think, where the field is going, or what to expect in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years. What would be really cool?
So I'm just going to give my perspective is that we need to be worried about everyone, and we need to make sure that what we do here, we realize it impacts the developing world, because that's my most recent experience.
I like to leave everyone with a slogan, which I steal from Andrew Ng. AI is the new electricity. Think about it. The potential is unlimited.
Cool. In my end, it's more collaboration. So we need to really come together and collaborate and share the best practices so we don't do repetition. And that's the way of the future. And doing just-in-time approaches, that's my dream for the future. So,
this is a really exciting space for the applications of artificial intelligence. The future innovations you're going to see in drug development and healthcare will be driven by AI. And it's a fantastic spot to be in.
I'll say, I'm excited to see the industry as a whole embrace it, from the bedside, to the clinic, embracing, kind of all portions of AI to see what the possibilities really are, because we have yet to see that.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being there.